Japanese Tiger tank. It's the end of 1940. Germany, Italy, and Japan don't want the US to join World War II and ruin all their conquest plans. So they decided to make an alliance. It was agreed, if anyone not in the war right now decides to attack us that happen to have a big army, lots of troops, and is overseas, and sometimes likes to wear pointy cowboy hats, that would firstly be a very uncool thing to do. But secondly, we three will fight back together as one, so you really definitely shouldn't do that. This didn't work. The US started helping the alliance's enemies, Britain and China, even more, but the pact did open the door for a good old collab between Germany and Japan, who began sharing military tech, such as, you guessed it, the Tiger tank. The countries had already worked together before. During the early days of the war, the two countries frequently shared industrial production patents and weapons blueprints. It was largely the Japanese who benefited the greatest from this collaboration, as there was a lot to be learned from the Germans. The Japanese were interested in a variety of German tech, including planes, rockets, submarines, and others. However, once the tides of war began to turn, they also began to pay particular attention to the infamous German tank designs. They were most impressed by one particular design, the Panzerkampfwagen the 6 OSS, or more commonly known as the Tiger tank. As the Allies were nearing the main Pacific islands towards the end of the war, the Japanese were eager to get the Tigers in their arsenal. At the beginning of World War II, the Imperial Japanese Armed Forces was one of the most formidable fighting powers in the world. Compared to the naval force, though, the Imperial Japanese Army was considerably less developed. This wasn't a result of inadequacy, however, but rather the pre- and early war conditions that had not required the Japanese to build a more powerful army than it already had. The weapons and equipment in the Imperial Japanese Army's inventory was sufficient to defeat its enemies in China and Southeast Asia, and to keep the territories under control. As for the war on the Pacific Islands, the Japanese command decided that lighter weapons and equipment were far better suited for the difficult environment, as well as being cheaper and easier to transport on ship. The Japanese government was keen to maintain a strict budget with the army, and rather invest the majority of finances into its high-priority Navy and Air Force. The Imperial Japanese Army's tank fleet was limited to tankettes, light tanks, and medium tanks. The most widely produced Japanese tank was the Type 97 Chia medium tank, as well as its improved turret version, the Type 97 Kaishin Hodo Shinya, a 4-crew tank armed with a 57mm gun. The Type 97 was a relatively small medium tank, but it served its purpose in the Pacific Campaign. The Japanese soon learned that their tanks were far inferior when, in 1943, the Americans introduced the M4 Sherman medium tanks to the Pacific theater of war, which soon became the dominant armor in the Far East, outperforming any adversary. It had become apparent to senior Japanese military officials that when the Americans were to launch their inevitable attacks on the key Japanese-held islands of the Pacific, the Imperial Army would struggle immensely to counter the now superior American armored units. They therefore needed a more powerful tank, and so they turned to their European allies, the Germans, for help. The Japanese ambassador in Berlin, General Hiroshi Oshima, was tasked with making a deal with the Germans on purchasing blueprints, along with an example tank that could suit the new Japanese need. In early 1943, they bought two versions of the Panzer III, one armed with a 50mm gun, and another with a 75mm gun. By the time the tanks were transported to Japan and reached their destination, however, they were already obsolete. Not even the Panzer IV was capable of meeting their pressing demands. The Japanese were looking for something far more powerful. General Hiroshi Oshima had previously visited German troops fighting on the Eastern Front and had come away extremely impressed with the Tiger tanks. It was soon decided that this was precisely the tank the Japanese needed to fight the Sherman. So, in May of 1943, General Oshima approached the Germans with a proposal to buy a blueprint and an example of a Tiger I, along with ammunition. The Japanese ambassador was invited to the Henschel factory to learn more about the production process and the technical requirements for producing such a tank. The German engineers were explicit in explaining that the production of the Tiger tank would require far more than simply buying a blueprint. The Japanese were to ensure that the industry and materials used were compatible with the Tiger tank's production requirements. After a series of discussions, the Japanese finally purchased an example of a Tiger I chassis number 250,455 for 645,000 Reichsmarks, or about 258,000 Reichsmarks. Ironically, the German government only paid 300,000 Reichsmarks per vehicle. The Japanese were likely charged more, as this was the actual commercial cost of the tank. In comparison to the Tiger I, the production cost of a Type 97 Chia without armament was roughly 126,000 yen, or about $33,008. The Tiger tanks were to allow the Japanese to make a giant leap in tank technology. By all of its features, the Tiger was far superior to anything in the Japanese arsenal, including the best armor they had, the Type 97 Chi medium tank. First of all, with a weight of 60 tons, the Tiger was more than 3 times heavier than the Type 97 Chi, which weighed only 18 tons. The Tiger I also had significantly thicker armor than the Type 97. Its frontal hull and turret armor was 100 millimeters thick, hull side plates 60 millimeters, and its turret sides and rear was 80 millimeters. The Tiger had one of the most powerful armaments of World War II, the .8 centimeter Kampfwagenkanone. Compared to it, the Type 97 47 millimeter gun was far weaker and often struggled to penetrate American armor. The Tiger's Panzer Granite 40 armor-piercing round, on the other hand, could penetrate up to 171 millimeter thick steel armor. It's hard to predict how much Japan would have benefited from having their own version of the Tiger I. Would it have made a big difference defending Manchuria later against the Soviets, or with countering the island leapfrogging us tanks in the Pacific? Before this could have been known, the Japanese officials soon realized how much of a logistical challenge it was to transport these mighty vehicles across the vast distance from Germany to Japan. The Germans and the Japanese had previous experience in transporting weapons and equipment they exchanged, but this was to be an unprecedented task. In most cases, an item would be disassembled into smaller parts and shipped across the sea in a submarine. The problem with the Tiger was that it was simply too large for this even when disassembled. The largest problem was its giant hull, which weighed almost 30 tons. In addition to this, by this time the Allied navies had enormous control over which ships were to pass across the oceans between Europe and Japan. Nevertheless, the Japanese Tiger was shipped to Bordeaux as the plans for its shipping were arranged. Its journey was soon abruptly cut off when in June 1944, the Allies launched their invasion of Europe. The Germans were to mobilize all the forces at their disposal. An idle Tiger heavy tank in the port of Bordeaux was a luxury they couldn't afford to ignore. And so on September 21st, the Japanese agreed to loan their Tiger to the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion, later renamed the 501st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion. It's after these events that the fate of the tank becomes largely unknown. It's generally believed that the tank was destroyed by Allied forces during the chaotic German retreat across France. Despite enormous efforts and grand monetary spendings from the Japanese, The tank was never to arrive on the shores of Japan, as it was never to see combat in the Pacific theater, fighting underneath the flag of the rising sun.